Hello everyone. So, welcome to lecture 2 in our series on world history. Today we're moving back to Europe. Remember in lecture 1, we talked about the Columbian Exchange. We're mainly focused on the Americas, with some brief asides in the European context, but we were mainly talking about the effects that Columbus and the Columbian Exchange had on the American context. We talked about the conquistadores. We talked about the conquistador system versus the colony system. We talked about Columbus himself, the reasons why he leaves Europe in order to seek a new route to China. We talked about the collapse of Constantinople, the Ottoman conquest, and the embargo of the Silk Road. And we talked about, of course, Portuguese expansion in and around West Africa and beyond. Now, as an aside, in our last class, I talked about how the early explorations in the Americas were pretty heavily sponsored not only by the Spanish crown, but by the Catholic Church as well. And we talked about very briefly how the role of Pope was very different compared to what it is today. But I kind of left some threads hanging because we didn't actually talk about what Catholicism is or was at the time. So that's really what we're going to start off with right now. When we think about Catholicism, what you want to do is you want to think about the Catholic Church as the primary structure of it. Unlike other denominations of Christianity, Catholicism places the institution, the church, at the center. Not individual church with a guy leading a sermon, but a global entity, the Catholic Church, that is the core. And this Catholic Church has not only spiritual authority, religious authority, but political authority as well. Now, the Catholic Church is rather unique in that it is led by a pope who is elected by the College of Cardinals. All right, so any cardinal around the world, once every pope dies, serves for life. Once every pope dies, shows up in Rome to vote for the next pope. Now, theologically, what makes Catholicism different from other aspects of Christianity that we're going to look at today is that Catholics believe that Jesus was divine and not a human, not a mortal necessarily, or not a combination of the two. This will become important later when we talk about some of the theological debate that's about to happen. Now, in order to understand Martin Luther, what's about to happen in Europe, we need to understand not just Catholicism, but the other big ism that is really the big part of medieval society at the time. And that is feudalism. So, if you took a World I class, feudalism should not be a new concept. But what feudalism is a system of distributed land management. Okay? It makes a lot of sense in an era before the internet where you had lots of land and not a ton of people to run it and to control it. So, let's graph this out. Let me show you what I mean when I say feudalism. So, let's say, in my very humbleness, I am King Mark I, and I have been given all of this kingdom by the man upstairs, by God. I have been given this kingdom because of my divine right. This kingdom because of my divine right to rule. But I am but a man. I can't be everywhere at once. I can't control this whole kingdom on my own. And so I delegate. I find 5 people, let's say 5, it was usually more than 5, to divvy up the kingdom with me. I'll carve my kingdom into 5 roughly equal sections. And I offer each one of these individuals the opportunity to come work for me, to run a fifth of my kingdom. Now, this only works if we trust each other. This is a reciprocal relationship. I need to trust that the nobles, plot twist, these are Europe's nobles, aren't going to take the power that I've given them and use it against me. And the nobles need to trust that I'm not going to change my mind and take all of this privilege away from them. And so that works for now. But what the nobles find, these major nobles, these dukes and counts find, is that 1/5 of a kingdom is still a lot of kingdom. And they can't run it on their own either. So what do? Well, the same thing I did. They delegate again. They delegate to minor nobility, knights, barons, right? These smaller scale nobles. And these smaller scale barons do the same, and so on and so forth, down to the individual plots of land run by serfs, peasants, depending on the moment in time. Now, we have our system. What we haven't talked about is taxes. Because when we think about wealth being generated in a feudal economy, you have to ask yourself, where is the wealth being generated? And the answer is at the bottom. Peasants grow food and crops that will be sold for money. And so, when the peasants grow their food, they keep a very small portion for themselves, but the rest moves up the ladder. And each level gets a cut, but all of the money flows upwards. Now, who's the net winner in this system? Well, I am. I have ended up with the most money while doing the least amount of work. Alright? Feudalism, if it seems like a rigged system, it's because it kind of was, yeah? And a lot of this system was balanced by Catholicism in the background, telling people on the bottom of the income scale here not to worry. Their reward would be in the next life. Ora et labora. Work. And ultimately, the balance between feudalism and Catholicism had existed now for about 100 years. Now, I want to stress, because if you're the average person, you're being pulled in two directions. You have two authority figures in your life. You have the Catholic Church, not religious but political authority, and you have your local lords all the way up to your king. So finding that balance was difficult. Conflict between church and state in medieval Europe was, generally speaking, the norm. Trying to figure out where one entity's authorities began and another one ended. And it is in this context, this uneasy balance in the early 1500s, that Martin Luther posts 95 theses to the door of the cathedral in the German city of Wittenberg, setting off a firestorm. So who is this man? Who is Martin Luther? Well, Luther is the son of a wealthy merchant family. His family had wanted him to go into, the family business, but Luther felt that he had a higher calling. And so he asked to go to seminary, to theological school. And when he does, and he goes to school and he learns all these religious principles, and then exits to join the church, what he finds is that there's a bit of a dissonance between what the church was preaching and what the church was practicing. Now, I want to stress, because you might think that Martin Luther is some form of early revolutionary. He's not. Martin Luther's issues with the church are purely theological in nature. Martin Luther is against the dissonance between the church's actions and the scriptures, not of the effects on everyday people that the church's acts were having. And in particular, he takes issue with two practices that the church is doing during this period of time. The first is called the sale of indulgences. The idea of the sale of indulgences is as follows. There were people in medieval Europe, priests working for the church, whose sole job it was to go around the countryside seeking something altogether too common. Funerals. And once they'd found a funeral, this priest would set up shop, set up his little desk outside the funeral, wait for everyone to come out, pull over the grieving family, and announce to them, "Ladies and gents, I'm sorry for your loss, but I have some bad news. You see, Nana, knock on wood, you see, Nana didn't tell you some stuff. Nana was a sinner. Nana went to Vegas on weekends. And she repented later in life, but right now she's not in heaven like you think she is. She's not in hell. She is in purgatory. She can be saved. Now I can put in a good word with the Pope. And the Pope can put a good word in with the man upstairs. And, like the giant claw machine from Toy Story, God can reach down and pluck Nana's soul out of purgatory and place her right in heaven, where we both know she belongs. Now I can do the service for you for the low price of about 1/3 of your yearly income. How much do you love your grandmother? If this seems ethically manipulative, morally dubious, you'd be correct. But Martin Luther does not have an issue with either of those two things. Here's Martin Luther's issue. Martin Luther's issue is as follows. You are promising that God will do something in exchange for money. Something you can't promise because you can't promise that God will do anything. That's his issue. Okay? It's not the issue that you and I might have with this practice, but it's an issue that Luther has. The second issue that Martin Luther has is a similar one. That is the issue of simony. Now, what was simony? Well, let's go back to our feudal system. What happens at inheritance time in the feudal system? Well, usually, everything that I own would be inherited by my oldest surviving male heir. Which is all well and good for the firstborn son. But if you're second in line, chances are you stood to inherit nothing. Which means that you start looking at your older brother with something of the murder eyes, yeah? Because, hey, kill your older brother, well, you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. This is especially a problem in an era like medieval Europe, before birth control. So kids were pretty common. You didn't have 1, 2, or 3 children. You probably had 7, 8, or 9, all of whom are trying to murder each other for the inheritance money. Simony was a way to stop this. Nobles from around Europe could approach the church and in exchange for a very sizable donation, offer up one of their sons for a job in the church, the Catholic Church, a bishop, something cushy. Now, why is this important? Members of the Catholic Church are not allowed to have children. Now, parentheses, if you know anything about the history of the Catholic Church in this period, you know that they very much did Look at the history of a family like the Borgias, for example. But they were not recognized as being their children. This is where the term bastard comes from. That's what a bastard is, an unrecognized, illegitimate child happening out of wedlock. And so, for the father, this solves the problem, because this child, now working for the church, has been removed from the line of succession, whilst also not being destitute and out on the street. Right? They have a nice cushy job as a bishop. Everything works out. Now you'll notice here that both of these practices of the church seem to be done largely for financial gain. They're largely doing this to earn more money, either through selling of indulgences or through the practice of simony, selling of church jobs, essentially. Martin Luther's issue with simony is that this, however, led to a bunch of people working for the church who were not there because of a calling, they were there because of inheritance issues. And so they were not perhaps the best in communicating religious affairs to the faithful. Some of them could not even read or write, which is a problem when your job is mostly reading the Bible. So, Martin Luther posts his issues. He focuses on two in particular, but in the background, something else is happening. Something we looked at the end of our last class. The Columbian Exchange is starting to occur. Goods are crossing the Atlantic. So we said conquistadores are crossing the Atlantic. We said animals are crossing the Atlantic. We said disease is crossing the Atlantic in one direction. But what's crossing the other? It's a minor thing. But as it starts to cross and make its way across Europe, European society begins to change forever. And if you can't tell what that is, let's take a bit of a plot twist here and talk about potatoes. So why do potatoes matter? Look, most of high society in Europe were not eating potatoes. But for those lower classes, those on the bottom of that feudalism pyramid, potatoes were a game changer. Because potatoes have more calories per gram than anything currently available in the old world. Number one. And number two, potatoes are easier to grow. And so they're less labor intensive than a wheat or a barley or a rice. It is not a coincidence. Potatoes crossed the Atlantic in the mid-1500s. And from that point on, potatoes spread to every single national cuisine on planet Earth, from Ireland to India. There's one exception that I could think of, and that was Japan, and that is because Japan had a policy of murdering anyone who showed up on their shores, especially people with, let's just say, my level of melanin. So potatoes really never got to Japan until much, much later. But that's the only one that I could think of. China has potatoes in their food. Thailand has potatoes in their food. India has potatoes in their food. All around the world, this crop spread. Why? Because it was advantageous to eat it. But what does this mean in the short term for those peasants that are starting to eat potatoes? Well, let's think of society as developing a feudal society as developing something of a food surplus, right? You need a certain amount of peasants to produce enough calories for a society to eat. Now, with anything that was available in the old world, let's say our wheat, you would need far more people working far longer to feed everyone. But once potatoes make their way to the field, suddenly you can feed the same amount of people with fewer crops, and more importantly, with fewer people. And where do those people go? I mean, think about it. If you were given the opportunity to not live on the bottom of the income scale and to not farm for the rest of your life, wouldn't you take it? Well, that's exactly what these people did. And in droves, peasants start to leave the farms and move to the only place that they can go to, the city. Now, in explaining this divide between European cities and European countryside, I should mention, by the way, that it is in this period that the European cities really become European cities. For most of medieval history, there was one major city in Europe, and that was Rome, the only real metropolis. And even then, Rome had sharply declined from the Roman era. But now, Florence, Milan, Paris, London, Madrid, Sevilla, Barcelona, these big, large Western European cities start to grow because of the advent of New World crops making their way across the Atlantic and changing up the dynamics of food surplus. And in so doing, we need to talk about class. Now, what do I mean by class? I don't mean the class that you and I are in, but rather, I mean class as understood as someone's social status. Now, we're going to talk about class a lot later down in this class. But for the purposes of our discussion, at the time in Europe, there were 4 main classes. I call this the window graph, and I'm going to ask you guys to remember the window graph in later classes because this graph is going to come up over and over and over and over again. The window graph centers around 2 main divides in Western Europe. The urban and rural divide and the rich and poor divide. And when you divvy this up into quadrants, you start to see 4 very distinct classes. So let's start with the rural classes because these ones are easier. These are the ones that we've been talking about. Our nobility and the peasants. This is a relationship that is not based on money, it's based on land leasing. Nobles own all the land and lease out pockets of that land to individual landowners down to the individual peasants. But this doesn't work in cities. You can't grow crops in a city. An urban environment is based on money. Money that is increasing the more Spain is being gold across the Atlantic. And so, the urban rich and the urban poor are largely divided into groups that we've seen before. The urban rich are our trading classes. Remember, we talked about the Colombo family in our last class out of Genoa. That's a trading family. They make their money not so much in working, but rather in acquiring goods for a low price and then selling them for a high price. Early business, if you will. And the urban poor are largely the workers, those working for the urban rich. And as more peasants start to stream into the city to join the swelling groups of the working poor, there is another event. You'll be noticing that the Protestant Reformation has required at least 3 different things to happen. The first was Martin Luther, a disaffected young man who was against the church's behavior and vocal enough to talk about it. You needed the Columbian Exchange, and you needed this, the development of the printing press, the publishing of history's first books. And the first book published ever was a Bible in German. That is profound, because up until that point, the Bible had been exclusively written in Latin, a language reserved for the church and the nobility that the church was educating. More on church education in a minute. But now that the Bible has been published in German, a language that you and I, the layman, can understand, can, if we're lucky, read, but at worst have read to us and understand, this changes everything. Because it proves Martin Luther correct. When Martin Luther says, hey, the sale of indulgences is not in the Bible. Hey, simony, not in the Bible. These people have been fleecing you for money for centuries. I'm right. Profound change starts to happen. Now, we've looked at one side of this equation, but let's look at the other side of this equation. What is the Catholic Church doing? What has the Catholic Church been doing to really provoke this sort of thing? Now, remember, Martin Luther has common folk on his side. He's got peasants on his side, but peasants, they don't win wars. Nobles win wars. Weapons win wars. Martin Luther needs some, not all, but a good amount of Europe's nobility to support him and his protest of the Mother Church, which is why we call it Protestantism. That answer lies with the Pope himself. So this is a lithograph of how the Pope views himself in relation to the leaders of Europe at the time. You guys had to read for today two documents, two primary sources, the Dictatus Papae and the first-hand account of Henry IV at Canossa, in which Emperor Henry IV receives a mercy from the Pope, basically. Now, I want to focus on the Dictatus Papae. The Dictatus Papae was released about half a millennium earlier. And what it is Pope Gregory VII reading the Bible, and as a result, drawing from it political powers. This is the birth of the Pope's political power. Now, all of these are deliciously ridiculous and absurd. For example, that the Pope has never been wrong, nor will they ever be wrong. That all princes shall kiss his feet. But one of these is a superpower in a feudal society. That is the last one. That he may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men. This seems so minor, but in practice we give this power a name. We call it excommunication. Why is excommunication such a big deal? So let's go back to our feudal model here. Here I am, King Mark I. I have managed to anger the Pope to a point that I've been excommunicated by the Church. Remember, feudalism is a system of reciprocal relations. I need to trust the people that I've given power to, and they need to trust me. What happens when the Pope comes in and says, nobility, you no longer owe Mark I any loyalty? Well, now everything has changed. These nobles want one thing more than the job that they have, and that's my job. They would very much enjoy being the king, which means I'm on the chopping block. I'm dead. My family is dead. My kids are dead. My entire line removed from power. Excommunication is murder with the stroke of a pen. Now, if you're a noble living in this context, you very much hate the idea of excommunication, because excommunication means that you can never anger the Church. You can never do that. And so in comes Martin Luther. I want to go back and highlight something the Dictatus Papae says, which says, he who is not at peace with the Catholic Church can't be considered Catholic. And in comes Martin Luther says, you don't have to be. Have this hot new religion called Protestantism. Now, not everyone does. Remember, these are individuals who believe that hell is a real place and you can visit, but enough do. Enough do for it to be a problem. And when I say problem, I mean war. Europe enters a stage of war. We refer to this war by the name the 30 Years' War. So called because it did not last 30 years, by the way. The 30 Years' War is by far the bloodiest conflict Europe has ever seen, and a conflict that will not be matched until World War I. And I want to make this clear. We need to invent guns, tanks, planes, and mustard gas to get anywhere close to the level of carnage that the 30 Years' War does. That is for a pretty simple reason. The 30 Years' War is kind of two conflicts rolled into one. Just like the Pope is two figures rolled into one. First and foremost, the 30 Years' War is a religious conflict, obviously. People, individuals, want religious and, most importantly, spiritual independence from the church. They want to be able to pick up their own Bibles, read it, and formulate their own opinions. Something which they have been doing. Protestantism is the beginning. But then you have, arising with it, the Reformed Church, the Calvinist Church, the Lutheran Church, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Baptists, all the denominations of Christianity, with the exception of the Mormons, begin to show up around this period of time. And people wanted the freedom to do that, especially because they were leaving a church that they viewed, not incorrectly, as being just hopelessly corrupt, hopelessly unsavable. All right? So that's the religious aspect. But the nobles want something altogether different. They want political independence from the Pope. They want to be able to run their own affairs without worrying that the Pope will be displeased and have, in practice, the ultimate veto over all of their behavior. Because I will never truly be free and independent as a leader of Spain or France or England if I'm worried that my actions will upset the Pope to the point that he excommunicates me, and in which case I'm no longer the king of that country. And the next king will know better not to piss off the Pope. Now, this bloody war ends with two major peace treaties. The first, one we're going to focus on today, is called the Treaty of Augsburg. The core point of the Treaty of Augsburg is cuius regio, eius religio. This is Latin for you must follow the religion of your ruler. So if your king had converted to Protestantism, congratulations, so are you. This solves the political fighting. This solves the stalemate, the conflict that has been going on. But in practice, the religious conflict was not about the nobles. The religious conflict was about the people. And people don't like to be told to convert by their king or by the Pope. And so in practice, the Treaty of Augsburg really solves nothing. It moves the conflict, the religious conflict, to one between countries, so no longer France versus Austria, to one within countries, France versus itself. Protestants and Catholics fighting in France, Protestants and Catholics fighting in Brandenburg, and so on and so forth. To a disturbing degree. I did say the bloodiest conflict in European history until World War I. Now, this story, we're going to put a pin in this story because we're going to come back to it when we discuss the nation state in a few weeks. I don't remember if that's a Tuesday or a Friday. So I'm going to stop this right here. I'm going to put a pin in this, and we're going to pick up here, right where we left off, in a few weeks when we loop back to Europe at the end of Unit 1. So, hope that worked for you. Let me know if this format works and if I need to change something up. And other than that, ladies and gents, I will see you next time. Bye.